All right, moon gazers and history dreamers. Tonight, we sharpen our focus on the samurai, a figure shrouded in myth, katana in hand, honor burning bright. But strip away that legend and what do you find? During the seismic collapse of feudal Japan, being a samurai wasn't just tough, it was an identity crisis wrapped in an anachronism, often ending in despair. We're about to witness a world torn asunder through the eyes of its most iconic and perhaps most lost warrior. If this journey into the quiet, crushing end of an era sparks curiosity, a like and subscribe helps. Where are you listening from? What time is it? Now, lower the lights. Let's ease into the painful twilight of the samurai. For over 2 centuries, Japan slumbered under the Tokugawa Shogunate, an era known as the Edo period. Within this long peace, the samurai stood at the apex of society. They were the inheritors of a fearsome warrior legacy, yet their reality was often far removed from the battlefield. They evolved. Many became bureaucrats, administrators, scholars, even poets. They were the educated elite, the moral compass expected to embody Bushido, the way of the warrior. This code, romanticized and painstakingly refined in times of peace, painted them as paragons of loyalty, discipline, and honor. They were the living symbols of Japan's inherent strength and tradition. But beneath this veneer of reverence, deep cracks were forming. 250 years without major conflict meant most samurai were warriors in name only. Their martial skills, once essential, grew rusty. More pressingly, their economic foundation was crumbling. Their stipends, paid in rice, struggled to keep pace with a burgeoning cash economy. Many found themselves owing vast sums to merchants, a class they held in contempt. This wasn't the heroic image painted in scrolls. It was a reality of mounting debt, dwindling relevance, and quiet anxiety. The proud elite was becoming impoverished. Then, in 1853, the outside world shattered Japan's isolation. American Commodore Matthew Perry's black ships steamed into Edo Bay, their cannons a stark symbol of Western might. It was a profound shock. The shogunate was technologically outmatched and politically paralyzed. Perry demanded Japan open its ports, and the shogunate, facing overwhelming military force, had little real choice but to concede. The arrival wasn't just an intrusion, it was an exposure of Japan's vulnerability, a deep wound to its pride, felt most acutely by its warriors. The shockwaves ignited a powerful, often violent backlash. The Sonojoa, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians movement, swept the land. It resonated deeply with many samurai, especially lower ranks from outer domains like Satsuma and Choshu. They saw the shogunate's concessions as a profound betrayal of Japan's sacred traditions. They yearned for a return to direct imperial rule and a fierce resistance against foreign encroachment. This wasn't a unified front. It was a fractured landscape of competing loyalties, a civil war brewing within the heart of the samurai. Faced with dissent and pressure, the shogunate desperately tried to adapt. It initiated reforms, seeking to modernize its military. Ironically, this meant hiring Western advisors and adopting the very technologies the Joy faction despised. They invested in firearms, modern warships, and Western-style military structures. These complex attempts were seen by many samurai as further evidence of the shogunate's weakness and betrayal. The unequal treaties signed with Western powers only added fuel, perceived as national humiliations the ruling class should have prevented. At its heart lay a fundamental truth. The samurai's essence was becoming obsolete. Their traditional arts, sword, bow, horse, while embodying deep cultural and spiritual significance, were ineffective against rifles, cannons, and conscripted armies. The world was changing at a dizzying pace. The Industrial Revolution, Western ideologies, and global trade were forces that couldn't be held back by a katana or a code of honor. Feudalism itself, the very system that gave the samurai their historic purpose and privilege, was on its deathbed. The Boshin War exploded. Samurai fought samurai, but the tide turned for Sonojoy forces, armed with modern weaponry and a vision of a new Japan. In 1868, the Tokugawa Shogunate fell, and Emperor Meiji was restored. For many samurai who fought for this, it felt like a triumph. But this victory was profoundly bittersweet, a cruel twist of historical fate. The new Meiji government, led by former samurai, was focused on modernization, fukoku kyohei, enrich the country, strengthen the army, and that meant dismantling the old ways. The Meiji Restoration sealed the samurai's doom. The new government moved swiftly. Feudal domains were abolished in 1871, replaced by prefectures. A national conscripted army, open to all classes, was established in 1873, making the samurai's exclusive right to bear arms irrelevant. In 1876, the final ultimate indignity, samurai were forbidden from wearing their swords, the iconic symbol of their soul and status. Their stipends were converted into government bonds, often at a fraction of their value. In less than a decade, an entire class was stripped of its privileges, its purpose, and its identity. For over 2 centuries, Japan existed in a state of carefully cultivated stillness. Under the Tokugawa Shogunate, the policy known as sakoku, or chained country, had kept the islands largely sealed off from the wider world. It was an era of unprecedented peace, a long, quiet breath after centuries of civil war. Cities like Edo, Kyoto, and Osaka flourished, developing unique cultures. Society was rigidly ordered, a complex hierarchy with the samurai at its pinnacle. To most Japanese, this was the world as it was, and as it should be, stable, predictable, and above all, Japanese. The roots of sakukuku ran deep, entwined with fear and a desire for control. The early encounters with Portuguese and Spanish missionaries in the 16th and 17th centuries had convinced the shogunate that Christianity was a destabilizing force, a potential precursor to colonial ambition. To preserve the Tokugawa order and prevent powerful regional lords, the daimyo, from forging their own foreign alliances, the shogunate acted decisively. Foreigners were expelled, Japanese were forbidden from traveling abroad, and Christianity was brutally suppressed. Only a sliver of contact remained. Life under sakuku, while peaceful, was far from static. The samurai, with no wars to fight, transitioned into roles as administrators, scholars, and officials. Yet their economic base often struggled. Below them, merchants, theoretically the lowest class, gained significant wealth and influence. Farmers toiled, artisans crafted, and a vibrant popular culture, the ukiyo, or floating world, emerged in the cities. It was a society looking inward, refining its own arts, philosophies, and social structures, largely oblivious to the Industrial Revolution transforming the West. Yet Japan was not entirely blind. Through the tiny Dutch trading post at Dejima in Nagasaki Harbor, a trickle of Western knowledge flowed in. Known as rangaku, or Dutch studies, it allowed a small dedicated group of scholars and officials to learn about Western science, medicine, and technology. They translated books, studied maps, and marveled at Western inventions. These scholars began to understand the growing power disparity between Japan and the outside world, but their warnings were often dismissed or ignored by the deeply conservative shogunate. The shadows of foreign ships had occasionally flickered on the horizon before 1853. Russians had probed from the north, British ships had made inquiries, and even an American vessel, the Morrison, had been repelled under the harsh edict to repel foreign vessels. More ominously, news of Britain's decisive victory over China in the First Opium War, 1839-42, reached Japan. The sight of a vast ancient empire like China being humbled by Western military might sent a ripple of unease through those few who understood its implications. The world was shrinking, and the walls of Sakoku were looking increasingly fragile. Then, on July 8, 1853, the unthinkable happened. 4 immense vessels appeared off the coast at Uraga, at the very entrance to Edo Bay. But these were unlike any ships the Japanese had ever seen. They moved against the wind and tide, propelled by unseen forces, belching thick black smoke into the pristine summer sky. They were Commodore Matthew C. Perry's squadron, the infamous Kurofune, the Black Ships. Their sudden, almost alien appearance struck a chord of deep, primal fear into the hearts of all who witnessed them. The squadron was led by the USS Susquehanna, Perry's flagship, accompanied by the Mississippi, both formidable steam-powered paddle frigates, along with 2 sailing sloops, the Plymouth and Saratoga. It wasn't just their size or their steam power that terrified, it was their visible armament. These ships carried state-of-the-art Paixhan shell guns. Unlike traditional cannonballs, these fired explosive shells capable of reducing Japanese wooden fortifications and buildings to splinters and ash with terrifying efficiency. The Black Ships were a potent, floating demonstration of overwhelming military superiority. Perry, a stern and experienced naval officer, understood the power of psychological warfare. He deliberately chose Edo Bay, the shogun's doorstep, ignoring Japanese demands to sail to Nagasaki. He ordered his ships to conduct menacing surveys of the bay, their guns pointed towards the shore. To celebrate American Independence Day and further intimidate the Japanese, he fired a 73-gun salute using only blank cartridges, the thunderous roar echoing across the water, a clear message of power held in reserve. He refused to deal with low-ranking officials, demanding only the highest representatives. Perry carried a letter from U.S. President Millard Fillmore. Its contents, while couched in diplomatic language, were backed by the implicit threat of force. It requested humane treatment for shipwrecked American sailors, the right for American ships to purchase coal and provisions, and most significantly, the opening of one or more ports for trade. To further showcase Western might, Perry brought gifts: a miniature steam locomotive complete with track, a telegraph set, telescopes, and American whiskey, all intended to dazzle and cow the Japanese. Within Edo Castle, the headquarters of the shogunate, the arrival triggered disbelief, then panic. The shogun, Tokugawa Ieyasu, was ill and would die shortly after, leaving the decision-making to his chief counselor, Abe Masahiro. Abe and his advisors knew Japan's coastal defenses were laughably inadequate. They had matchlock guns, cannons that were often centuries old, and a warrior class trained for sword fighting, not naval gunnery. They were utterly, terrifyingly outmatched. There was no military option against the black ships. In a move that shattered precedent and signaled the shogunate's desperation and weakness, Abe Masahiro took the extraordinary step of polling all the daimyo, the regional lords, for their opinions on how to respond to Perry's demands. For centuries, the shogunate had ruled by decree. Asking for advice was an admission of uncertainty, an invitation for dissent. It opened a Pandora's box of competing interests and opinions, fundamentally undermining the shogun's authority at the worst possible moment. The lords were deeply divided. For the samurai class, the black ships represented a profound existential crisis. They were the hereditary protectors of Japan and the embodiment of its martial spirit. Their entire identity, their social standing, their code of Bushido was built upon their ability to defend the nation. Yet, faced with Perry's steam frigates and Paikishan's guns, their revered katanas and traditional martial skills seemed tragically, almost comically, inadequate. Their world, their very reason for being, was being threatened by an enemy they could not fight. This sense of powerlessness quickly morphed into a volatile mix of humiliation and fury. How could these barbarians, as many viewed the Westerners, sail with impunity into Japan's most sacred waters? How could the shogunate, which the samurai served, seem so incapable of fulfilling its most basic duty, defense? The smoke from the black ships choked not only the air but also the pride of the warrior class. It ignited a burning shame that would fuel decades of turmoil, rebellion, and change. Having delivered his letter and his ultimatum, Perry departed, promising to return the following spring with an even larger fleet for Japan's answer. His departure left Japan in a state of high anxiety and furious debate. Should they resist, risking certain destruction? Or should they capitulate, sacrificing centuries of tradition and risking national humiliation? Factions formed. Kaikoku, open the country proponents, argued for pragmatism and learning from the West, while Jōri expelled the barbarians. Advocates demanded resistance, whatever the cost. True to his word, Perry returned in February 1854. This time, his fleet numbered 8 imposing warships. The message was unmistakable. Negotiation would happen one way or another. The shogunate, still deeply divided but acutely aware of its military weakness and the disastrous example of China, had run out of options. The internal debates had yielded no viable strategy for resistance. With heavy hearts and under immense pressure, they agreed to negotiate. On March 31, 1854, on the shores of Kanagawa, near modern Yokohama, representatives of the United States and the Tokugawa Shogunate signed the Convention of Kanagawa, also known as the Treaty of Peace and Amity. It wasn't a full commercial treaty, but it shattered the foundations of sakuku. It stipulated the opening of 2 ports, Shimoda and Hakodate, to American ships. Though primarily for refueling and reprovisioning, not widespread trade, it guaranteed the safety and good treatment of shipwrecked American sailors. Crucially, the treaty also permitted the United States to establish a consulate at Shimoda. This meant a permanent American diplomatic presence on Japanese soil, a significant concession that had been unthinkable just a year earlier. While the shogunate had managed to avoid a full, immediate opening to trade, the black ships had forced the gates ajar. The 2-century-long isolation was officially over. The West now had its foot firmly planted in the door of Japan. Hidden within the treaty's 12 articles was Article 9, the Most Favored Nation Clause. This stipulated that any privileges Japan granted to other nations in the future would automatically be granted to the United States as well. At the time, it might have seemed a standard diplomatic point. In reality, it was a powerful lever. It ensured that once Japan made concessions to one Western power, all of them would benefit, creating a cascade effect that would rapidly erode Japanese control. The man who would fully exploit this opening was Townsend Harris, the first American consul. Arriving in Shimoda in 1856, he relentlessly pushed for a comprehensive commercial treaty. Lacking Perry's naval muscle, but armed with diplomatic skill and news of Britain's further military actions in China, Harris wore down the shogunate's resistance. In 1858, Japan signed the Treaty of Amity and Commerce, known as the Harris Treaty. This was the moment the floodgates truly opened. The Harris Treaty and the similar Ansei treaties, quickly signed with Britain, France, Russia, and the Netherlands, were deeply unequal. They forced Japan to open more ports to trade, limited its ability to set its own import tariffs, robbing it of revenue and protecting foreign goods, and granted extraterritoriality. This last point was perhaps the most galling. It meant that foreigners in Japan were subject to their own consular courts, not Japanese law. It was a direct assault on Japanese sovereignty. The signing of these unequal treaties was a moment of profound national humiliation. Japan, which had viewed itself as a divine land, protected and unique, was now being treated like a subordinate state, its laws and trade dictated by foreign powers. For the samurai, this was the ultimate failure. Their leaders had capitulated, their nation had been shamed, and their own status seemed increasingly precarious. The cannon smoke of 1853 had now settled into a thick fog of anger, resentment, and a desperate desire to reclaim Japan's honor. The arrival of Commodore Perry's black ships and the subsequent signing of the unequal treaties didn't just open Japan's ports, they ripped open deep fissures within Japanese society itself. The foundations of the Tokugawa Shogunate, which had seemed unshakable for over 2 centuries, began to tremble. The humiliation felt by many, especially within the samurai class, quickly curdled into anger, resentment, and a desperate search for a way to restore Japan's pride and sovereignty. This wasn't just a foreign policy crisis, it was an internal meltdown. The shogunate's authority, once absolute, was now bleeding away. Its primary failure, in the eyes of many, was its inability to uphold its most fundamental duty, protecting Japan from foreign threats. The barbarians had not been expelled, they had been appeased. Furthermore, the decision to consult the daimyo on how to respond to Perry, an unprecedented act, had broadcasted weakness and invited dissent. Signing treaties without the emperor's explicit sanction was seen by many as a grave overreach, a betrayal of the highest authority in the land. In this vacuum of trust, eyes turned towards Koto, the ancient imperial capital. For centuries, the emperor had been a revered, almost divine figure, but one largely devoid of real political power. The shogun, ruling from Edo, held the reins. Now, however, the emperor, Komei, became a potent symbol. He represented an unbroken line stretching back into myth, a symbol of pure, untainted Japanese identity, a rallying point for those disillusioned with the shogunate's handling of the foreign crisis. He was the counterweight to Edo's perceived weakness. This sentiment crystallized into a powerful 4-character slogan, Sonojwa, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. It was a simple, potent, and deeply resonant call to action. It appealed directly to traditional samurai values of loyalty and martial pride. It offered a clear target for their anger, the foreigners, and a clear alternative to the shogunate's perceived appeasement, the emperor. It suggested that by restoring the emperor to his rightful place and driving out the intrusive Westerners, Japan could reclaim its soul and its strength. The Sonojoi movement gained particular traction among lower-ranking samurai. These men often faced economic hardship and felt stifled by the rigid hierarchy. They saw the current crisis as both a threat and an opportunity, a chance to prove their worth, to serve a higher cause, and perhaps to overturn the established order. It also found fertile ground in the Tozama domains, powerful regions like Satsuma and Choshu that had historically been rivals of the Tokugawa, and now saw a chance to increase their influence. Faced with this rising tide of dissent, the shogunate reacted with force. In 1858, a powerful and decisive figure, Ii Naosuke, was appointed Tairo, or Great Elder, effectively acting as regent. He was a hardliner, determined to reassert shogunate authority. He believed that opening Japan to trade was inevitable and that internal dissent was the greater threat. He pushed through the Harris Treaty without waiting for imperial approval, a move that infuriated loyalists in Kyoto and beyond. Naosuke didn't stop there. He intervened in the shogunate succession dispute, ensuring his preferred candidate took power. Then, he launched the Ansei Purge. Between 1858 and 1860, he ruthlessly cracked down on anyone who opposed his policies. Daimyo were forced into retirement, court officials were arrested, and prominent Sonojoi scholars and activists, including the influential Yoshida Shoin, were imprisoned or executed. It was a brutal attempt to silence the opposition through fear. But the Ansei Purge backfired. Instead of crushing dissent, it fanned the flames of hatred against Ai and the shogunate he represented. It created martyrs and drove the opposition underground, making it more radical and more violent. The crackdown confirmed the worst fears of the loyalists, that the shogunate was a tyrannical power willing to sacrifice both tradition and its own people to appease foreigners and maintain its grip. The stage was set for violent retribution. On a snowy morning, March 24, 1860, as Ii no Soke's procession approached the Sakurada Gate of Edo Castle, it was ambushed. A group of 17 radical samurai, mostly from the Mito domain and one from Satsuma, launched a ferocious attack. Despite being heavily outnumbered by Ii's guards, their determination and fury carried the day. They cut down the guards, dragged the Tairo from his palanquin, and beheaded him. It was an act of stunning audacity. The Sakuradamon incident sent shockwaves across Japan. The shogunate's most powerful figure had been assassinated in broad daylight mere steps from the shogun's castle. It was an undeniable demonstration of the shogunate's vulnerability and the fierce determination of its enemies. It emboldened radical samurai everywhere and severely damaged the prestige and authority of the Tokugawa regime. The era of Tenchu, Heaven's Revenge, or righteous assassination, had begun in earnest. These radical samurai, often young, low-ranking, and fiercely idealistic, became known as shishi, men of high purpose. They saw themselves as patriots acting to save Japan. Operating in the shadows of Kyoto, Edo, and domain capitals, they plotted, conspired, and frequently killed. Their targets were shogunate officials, perceived traitors, and foreigners. While their ideology was often rooted in sono-joi, their actions added a dangerous, unpredictable element to the political landscape. Figures like Yoshida Shoin, even after his execution, became inspirational figures. His teachings fueled the ambitions of future leaders from Choshu. Others, like Sakamoto Ryoma of Tosa, initially followed the radical path but eventually sought a more pragmatic, negotiated solution, envisioning a new Japan that could stand strong in the modern world. But in these chaotic years, the flash of the assassin's sword often spoke louder than the voice of reason. The great Tozama domains of Satsuma and Choshu in southwestern Japan became crucibles of this anti-shogunate sentiment. Historically resentful of Tokugawa rule, possessing strong martial traditions and significant economic resources, they began to openly defy Edo. They modernized their armies, often with Western technology acquired through illicit trade, and jockeyed for influence at the imperial court in Kyoto, seeking to position themselves as the true defenders of the emperor and the nation. Satsuma, initially more conservative and Choshu more radically Joi, often found themselves at odds. Choshu samurai even attempted to seize control of the imperial palace in 1864 in the Kinmon incident, only to be driven out by shogunate and Satsuma forces. Yet, beneath the rivalry, a shared antipathy towards the Tokugawa remained, and influential figures worked tirelessly to bridge the gap. The Huawei part of the slogan, "Expel the Barbarians," led to direct, often disastrous confrontations. In September 1862, a group of Satsuma samurai encountered British merchants near the village of Namamugi. A perceived slight led to violence, and one British merchant, Charles Lennox Richardson, was killed. Britain demanded a huge indemnity and the execution of the samurai responsible. When Satsuma prevaricated, the Royal Navy responded. In August 1863, a British squadron sailed to Satsuma's capital, Kagoshima, and bombarded it. While the samurai fought back bravely, the city was devastated. This brutal demonstration of Western firepower was a sobering lesson for Satsuma. It showed that blindly expelling the barbarians was impossible. It spurred them to accelerate their own military modernization, but it also planted the seeds of a more pragmatic approach to foreign relations. Choshu, too, learned this lesson the hard way. Taking the Joi call literally, Choshu forces began firing upon Western ships passing through the Straits of Shimonoseki. In September 1864, a powerful combined fleet of British, French, Dutch, and American warships retaliated. They systematically destroyed Choshu's coastal batteries and landed troops, inflicting a humiliating defeat. Like Satsuma, Choshu realized that sheer will could not overcome industrial-era weaponry. These defeats, while humiliating, were paradoxically strengthening the anti-shogunate cause. They demonstrated that the shogunate could not protect Japan, and that if Japan were to stand a chance, it needed radical reform and modernization, something the increasingly sclerotic shogunate seemed incapable of delivering. Satsuma and Choshu began to see that Joi must wait. First, the shogunate must fall. Imagine being an ordinary samurai during these years. Your entire world, your code of Bushido, was based on loyalty. But loyalty to whom? To your daimyo, whose interests might now diverge from the shogun's? To the shogun, whose authority was collapsing and whose policies seemed weak? Or to the distant, almost mythical emperor now being presented as the true sovereign? These weren't abstract questions, they were matters of life and death. A samurai's friends might suddenly become enemies based on shifting political allegiances. Walking the streets of Kyoto could mean facing an assassin's blade. Orders from Edo might contradict orders from your domain, or even the perceived will of the emperor. The old certainties, the clear lines of command and duty that had defined the samurai for centuries, had dissolved into a bloody, confusing morass. This internal conflict tore the samurai class apart. While some clung fiercely to the shogunate, others threw their lot in with the imperial cause. Many simply tried to survive, navigating the treacherous political currents. Assassinations became commonplace, small-scale battles and skirmishes erupted between domains or between loyalists and shogunate forces. It was a time of intense paranoia, fractured loyalties, and profound anxiety. The shogunate, weakened by Inosuke's assassination and subsequent internal power struggles, attempted reforms, trying to co-opt its rivals through policies like kobugatai, union of court and shogunate. But these efforts were too little, too late. The forces unleashed by the black ships and fueled by internal dissent were now too powerful to contain. The once mighty Tokugawa Shogunate was stumbling toward its end. The Sono-joi movement, though its joy aspect had been tempered by harsh reality, had irrevocably shifted the political center towards Kyoto. The great domains of Satsuma and Choshu, now secretly allied, were preparing for the final push. For the individual samurai, the chaos was far from over, but the path ahead pointed towards a climactic, and for many, devastating confrontation. The final years of the Tokugawa Shogunate were a maelstrom of political intrigue, armed conflict, and collapsing authority. The Sono-joi movement, though its cry to expel barbarians had been tempered by the harsh reality of Western firepower, had successfully elevated the emperor as the ultimate symbol of legitimacy. The great domains of Satsuma and Choshu, once rivals, had forged a powerful alliance, their modernized armies poised to challenge the shogunate directly. The air crackled with anticipation. An era was ending, but what would replace it remained dangerously unclear. The shogunate, now under its final shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, attempted last-ditch reforms. Yoshinobu was an intelligent and capable leader, but he had inherited a sinking ship. He even made the unprecedented move of formally returning political authority to the emperor in November 1867, hoping to preempt his enemies and retain a key role in a new conciliar system of government led by a council of daimyo. He aimed to preserve the Tokugawa house, even if it meant sacrificing the shogunate's absolute power. But for the hardliners in Satsuma and Choshu, this was not enough. They saw Yoshinobu's move as a tactic, a way to maintain influence behind the scenes. They sought not a compromise, but a complete overthrow, a restoration that would place power firmly in their hands, legitimized by the emperor. Led by figures like Saigo Takamori of Satsuma and Kido Takayoshi of Choshu, they prepared to seize the moment through force, their goal to eliminate Tokugawa influence entirely. The moment came on January 3, 1868. Satsuma and Choshu troops, along with forces from allied domains, staged a bold coup d'etat. They stormed the imperial palace in Kyoto, securing the person of the young Emperor Meiji, who was only 15 years old. They swiftly issued an imperial edict, drafted by their allies at court like Iwakura Tomomi, proclaiming the full restoration of imperial rule. It declared the shogunate abolished and ordered the confiscation of all Tokugawa lands and powers. This was a direct challenge, a declaration of war. Tokugawa Yoshinobu, despite his earlier concessions, could not accept this complete obliteration of his house and the marginalization of his loyal vassals. Urged on by his supporters, he gathered his forces and marched from Osaka towards Kyoto, aiming to rescue the emperor from the evil advisors of Satsuma and Choshu. The Boshin War, the War of the Year of the Earth Dragon, had begun. The first and most decisive clash occurred just outside Kyoto in late January 1868, the Battle of Toba-Fushimi. On paper, the shogunate forces significantly outnumbered the Satsuma-Choshu-Tosa alliance, but numbers meant little against modern weaponry. The imperial forces were better equipped with Armstrong guns, Mini rifles, and even Gatling guns. They had superior training and, crucially, a unified command structure. The shogunate army, a more traditional force, was routed. The psychological impact was immense. When the imperial forces raised the Nishiki no Mihata, the imperial brocade banner, many shogunate troops, unwilling to fire upon the symbol of the emperor, lost heart or even switched sides. Tokugawa Yoshinobu, seeing the battle was lost, abandoned his army and fled back to Edo by ship. His flight shattered the morale of his remaining supporters. Though Toba-Fushimi was the turning point, the Boshin War dragged on for another year and a half. Imperial forces advanced, taking Edo Castle without a major battle, thanks largely to negotiations between Saigo Takamori and the shogunate's Katsukaishu. Pockets of resistance remained, most notably the fierce Eizu domain in the north, whose samurai fought with desperate courage but were ultimately overwhelmed. Their struggle became a tragic symbol of loyalty to a lost cause. The final stand took place even further north, on the island of Hokkaido. There, a group of former shogunate retainers, led by the naval officer Enomoto Takayuki, attempted to establish the independent Republic of Izo. They held out until June 1869, but they too were inevitably defeated by the superior forces of the new imperial government. The Boshin War was over. The Tokugawa Shogunate was history. The Meiji era had begun in earnest. But what did this Meiji Restoration truly mean? It was presented as a return to an ancient ideal, with the emperor once again guiding the nation. In reality, it was a revolution, orchestrated largely by a group of young, ambitious, and pragmatic lower-to-middle-ranking samurai from the victorious domains, primarily Satsuma and Choshu. These men, often referred to as the Meiji oligarchs, became the true architects of the new Japan. These oligarchs, men like Okubo Toshimichi, Kiro Takayoshi, Ito Hirobumi, and Yamagata Aritomo, were not traditionalists yearning for the past. They were realists. Their encounters with Western power, either directly or through observation, had convinced them that Japan faced a stark choice: modernize or be colonized. Their goal was to build a strong, centralized nation-state capable of standing on an equal footing with the West. The emperor was their symbol, their source of legitimacy, but they held the real power. To signal their intentions, the new government issued the Charter Oath in April 1868. Presented in the emperor's name, its 5 articles were a stunning blueprint for change. It called for the establishment of deliberative assemblies, the participation of all classes in state affairs, the abolition of evil customs of the past, the seeking of knowledge throughout the world, and the strengthening of imperial rule. It was a clear break from the closed, hierarchical world of feudal Japan. The old slogan, Sono Joy, quickly faded. Its purpose, to overthrow the shogunate, had been achieved. Its second part, expelling the barbarians, was now seen as dangerously impractical. It was replaced by a new, driving imperative, Fukoku Kyohei: enrich the country, strengthen the army. This became the guiding principle of the Meiji era. National survival and prosperity depended on rapid industrialization, economic development, and crucially, the creation of a modern military. This new vision had profound and often brutal implications for the samurai class. Though samurai had led the restoration, the very system they sought to build had no place for them as a privileged feudal warrior elite. The oligarchs knew that a centralized modern state could not coexist with the old patchwork of feudal domains. Their first major move was therefore revolutionary. In 1871, the government enacted Heihan Chiken, the abolition of the Han domains and the establishment of Ken prefectures. The 261 domains, which had formed the basis of political, social, and military power for centuries, were swept away with a stroke of the pen. The daimyo, the lords the samurai had served for generations, were summoned to Tokyo and effectively forced into retirement, pensioned off with titles and government bonds. This was a seismic shock. It severed the direct link between samurai and their lords, the foundation of feudal loyalty. Suddenly, a samurai from Satsuma or Aizu was no longer primarily a retainer of his domain, but a citizen of Japan, his local ties replaced by a direct relationship with the central government. The power base of the entire samurai class, the domains, had vanished overnight. The next blow struck at their very identity as warriors. In 1873, the government, under the guidance of Yamagata Aritomo, introduced a universal conscription law. It mandated that all Japanese men, regardless of their social class, were liable for military service. For the first time, commoners, farmers, artisans, merchants would be trained and armed, forming the backbone of the new Imperial Japanese Army. This move rendered the samurai class militarily obsolete. Their centuries-old monopoly on the legitimate use of force was broken. Their traditional martial skills, while respected, were secondary to rifle drills, artillery practice, and modern military discipline. The way of the warrior was being replaced by the way of the Western-style infantryman. It was a profound psychological blow, undermining their core purpose. Then came the stripping away of their visible symbols and remaining privileges. In 1876, the Haitorei, or Sword Abolition Edict, was issued. This banned samurai from wearing their daisho, the pair of long and short swords, in public. The sword was not just a weapon, it was the soul of the samurai, the ultimate badge of their status and honor. To be forbidden from wearing it was a deep public humiliation. Simultaneously, the distinctive samurai top-knot hairstyle was discouraged and eventually abandoned. While seemingly a minor point, it was another visible marker of their unique status, now erased. These measures aimed to create a visually uniform citizenry, eliminating the outward signs that set the samurai apart. They were being forcibly absorbed into the common mass. The final, and for many, the most devastating blow was economic. The samurai had traditionally lived on hereditary stipends paid in rice by their daimyo. The Meiji government initially took over these payments, but they constituted a crippling financial burden, almost a third of the national budget. The government simply could not afford to maintain a hereditary warrior class that no longer served its original function. Starting in 1873, the government began a process known as Chitsuroku Shobu, the commutation of these stipends. Samurai were encouraged, and eventually forced, to exchange their annual rice payments for a one-time payout in the form of government bonds. These bonds often paid low interest, their value depreciated rapidly, and many samurai, lacking financial acumen, were forced to sell them off quickly at a fraction of their worth. This act plunged thousands of samurai and their families into sudden poverty. They had lost their lords, their military purpose, their social symbols, and now their economic livelihood. They were expected to find new roles as farmers, merchants, teachers, or bureaucrats, often in a world they were ill-equipped to navigate. Many failed, facing destitution and despair. This entire process underscores the nature of the Meiji Restoration as a revolution from above. It wasn't a grassroots movement demanding the end of the samurai. It was engineered by a small, determined elite, many of whom were samurai themselves. They saw their own class with its feudal privileges and archaic structures as an impediment to building the strong, modern Japan they believed was necessary for survival. Thus, in a stunning historical irony, the very samurai who had fought to restore the emperor found themselves the primary victims of the new era they helped create. The restoration wasn't a return to the past, it was a ruthless, state-directed leap into the future, a leap that required shedding the skin of the feudal world, and with it, the samurai themselves. Their world wasn't just declining, it was being actively and swiftly dismantled. For centuries, a samurai's place in the world was defined not only by his swords, but also by his stipend. This was the koku, a measure of rice, the currency of feudal power and sustenance. Paid by their daimyo, these hereditary stipends determined a samurai's wealth, lifestyle, and social standing. It was the economic bedrock upon which their entire existence, their training, their service, their family life, was built. It signified their right as the ruling class to live off the agricultural surplus produced by the peasantry. This system, however, was far from uniform. A high-ranking hatamoto, or domain elder, might receive thousands of koku, affording a life of considerable comfort and influence. In stark contrast, a low-ranking ashigaru, or foot soldier, might receive barely enough to feed his family, often needing to supplement his income with side jobs, a practice sometimes viewed with disdain. The samurai class, often perceived as a monolithic entity, was in reality deeply stratified economically. Furthermore, even before Perry's arrival, the stipend system was under severe strain. 250 years of peace meant many samurai performed bureaucratic rather than martial roles. Simultaneously, Japan's economy was increasingly a monetary one. Rice stipends often had to be converted into cash through merchants, frequently at unfavorable rates. Many samurai, high and low, found themselves trapped in a cycle of debt to the very merchant class they officially looked down upon. The ideal samurai was above money. The reality was often one of quiet financial desperation. When the Meiji government swept away the domains in 1871 through Heian Chiken, it inherited this complex and burdensome system. Suddenly, the central government in Tokyo, not hundreds of individual daimyo, was responsible for paying the stipends of nearly 2 million samurai and their dependents. This represented an enormous financial drain, consuming roughly 30% of the entire national budget. It was an unsustainable burden for a new government determined to invest heavily in industry, infrastructure, and a modern military. The Meiji oligarchs knew that this system had to end. It was not only financially crippling, but also fundamentally incompatible with their vision of a modern, egalitarian nation-state. A hereditary class paid by the state simply for existing was an anachronism they could not afford, either economically or ideologically. The process of dismantling this ancient privilege, however, had to be handled carefully, lest it trigger widespread rebellion. They began with tentative steps. Initially, the government encouraged samurai to voluntarily surrender their hereditary stipend rights in exchange for a lump sum payment or more commonly government bonds. Some, particularly those already engaged in commerce or those seeing the writing on the wall, took the offer. But for many, especially those with larger stipends or those deeply attached to their status, The offers were unattractive. The bonds offered uncertain returns, and giving up a guaranteed income, however meager, was a frightening prospect. The voluntary approach proved too slow and insufficient. The financial pressure mounted. The oligarchs needed a decisive solution. That solution came in 1876 with the Chitsuroku Shobun, the disposition of hereditary stipends. This wasn't a request, it was an order. All remaining samurai stipends were to be compulsorily converted into interest-bearing government bonds, known as Kinyoku Kosai. The ancient system of rice payments, the economic lifeblood of the samurai for nearly a millennium, was terminated. The terms of the conversion were complex, but the outcome was often harsh. The bond's face value was calculated based on the original stipend, but higher-ranking samurai generally received bonds worth fewer years' income compared to lower-ranking ones. However, the interest rates were relatively low, typically 5% to 7%. Crucially, these bonds were payable over a period ranging from 5 to 30 years. It wasn't a sudden windfall, it was a structured and often diminishing payout. These Kidoku Kosai bonds quickly became a source of misery. Japan was experiencing significant inflation during this period, and the fixed interest payments rapidly lost their purchasing power. A bond that seemed adequate in 1876 might be worth far less in real terms just a few years later. The promise of long-term security proved illusory for many. The bonds, meant to be a transition tool, often became a trap. Worse still, many samurai lacked the financial literacy or the foresight to manage these new assets. Faced with immediate debts or simply needing cash to live, thousands sold their bonds on the open market. They often did so at heavily discounted prices, falling prey to shrewd merchants and moneylenders. A lump sum, even a small one, seemed preferable to a long wait for uncertain returns. This short-term relief often led to long-term ruin. The result was a wave of sudden, shocking poverty across a significant portion of the former samurai class. Families who had for generations enjoyed a degree of economic security and social prestige were cast adrift. They found themselves without income, without prospects, and often without understanding how this could have happened. The government, which they had in many cases helped bring to power, had pulled the economic rug out from under them. Imagine the scene. A man trained his entire life in swordsmanship, strategy, and Confucian classics, now forced to sell off family heirlooms, armor, swords, scrolls, just to buy rice. Imagine his wife, accustomed to managing a samurai household, now taking in laundry or working in a factory. Their children, who expected a life of privilege, now faced hunger and a future devoid of the certainties their ancestors had known. It was a social catastrophe playing out in countless homes. The government wasn't entirely oblivious. It promoted the idea of shizoku no shusan, finding new occupations for the shizoku, as the former samurai were now known. They were encouraged to become farmers, artisans, merchants, policemen, teachers, or government clerks. Grants and loans were sometimes offered to help them start new ventures. The intention was to integrate them into the new modern economy, but the transition was fraught with difficulty. Many samurai possessed few skills deemed practical in this new era. Centuries of conditioning had instilled in them a deep-seated disdain for manual labor and, especially, for commerce. The idea of haggling over prices or working the land was deeply alien and often seen as dishonorable. Their pride became an economic obstacle. Even those willing to adapt faced immense challenges. A samurai attempting to start a business often lacked capital, business acumen, and connections. Many fell victim to scams or simply failed due to inexperience. Attempts at farming often floundered because, despite living off agricultural surplus, most samurai knew nothing about actually cultivating rice. Their samurai shops, shizukuno shoho, became a byword for well-intentioned but doomed business ventures. Some did succeed. Those with education found roles in the burgeoning bureaucracy, military officer corps, or education system. Some adapted to business or moved into professions like law or medicine. Sakamoto Ryoma's Kamei Yamashachu, a precursor to a trading company, showed what was possible. Figures like Iwasaki Yataro, a samurai from Tosa, founded the Mitsubishi conglomerate. But these were the exceptions, not the rule. For many, the path downwards was steep and swift. But this economic devastation must be understood alongside the other losses. They had lost their right to rule, their military function, their right to wear swords, and their social status. Now their economic security was gone too. This wasn't just poverty, it was a profound identity crisis. It stripped away the last vestiges of what it meant to be a samurai. It was a deep, collective wound. The shame and despair felt by many dispossessed samurai cannot be overstated. They felt betrayed by the Meiji government, which many had fought to install. They saw their sacrifices in the Boshin War rewarded with poverty and irrelevance. They witnessed merchants, once beneath them, growing rich while they struggled to survive. This potent mix of economic hardship and wounded pride was a dangerous brew. It's no coincidence that the most significant armed uprisings against the Meiji government, like the Saga Rebellion, the Shinpuren Rebellion, and, most famously, the Satsuma Rebellion, led by Saigo Takamori, occurred in the mid to late 1000s, 870s, precisely when the economic hammer blows fell hardest. These were not just political protests, they were cries of desperation from a class facing economic and social annihilation. The Chitsuroku Shogun, the abolition of stipends, was perhaps the most brutal, yet most necessary step in the Meiji government's program. It was the financial severing that finally dissolved the samurai as a distinct, privileged class. It forced them, ready or not, to sink or swim in the turbulent waters of modern Japan. For countless samurai, it meant sinking into a world of hardship their ancestors could never have imagined. It truly sucked to be a samurai when the money ran out. More than any other object, the sword was the samurai. The daisho, the match pair of long katanas and shorter wakizashi, worn thrust through the obi or sash, was not merely a set of weapons. It was the most potent, visible symbol of their status, their privilege, and their unique place at the top of Japan's rigid social hierarchy. For centuries, only samurai were granted the right to wear these two swords, an exclusive privilege that instantly identified them to all. These blades were often far more than just tools of war. Many were priceless heirlooms passed down through generations, each with its own name, history, and legacy. They represented the continuity of the samurai lineage, a tangible link to ancestors who had wielded them in battle or service. The craftsmanship involved in creating a high-quality Japanese sword was itself a revered art form, imbuing the blade with an almost spiritual significance. To many, the sword was the tamashi, the very soul of the warrior. The bond between a samurai and his sword was forged in the philosophy of Bushido. Swordsmanship kenjutsu was not just about combat, it was a path to discipline, self-mastery, and spiritual insight. The sword represented the power of life and death, a power the samurai wielded with, ideally, solemn responsibility. It embodied their readiness to serve, to fight, and, if necessary, to die for their lord or their honor. The sword was central to their identity. This right to wear swords even carried the fearsome privilege known as kirishut gomen, the right to cut down and leave. In theory, a samurai could legally strike down a commoner who showed gross disrespect. While historical records suggest this right was exercised far less frequently than popular myth implies, its mere existence underscored the vast gulf between the samurai and other classes. It was a stark reminder of who held power. But the winds of change, blowing in with Perry's black ships, carried the scent of gunpowder, not tempered steel. The Boshin War, though fought by samurai, had brutally demonstrated the declining relevance of traditional martial arts. While sword charges occurred, battles were ultimately decided by rifles, cannons, and disciplined formations. The lone swordsman, however skilled, was becoming an anachronism on the modern battlefield. The Meiji leaders understood this all too well. Their vision for a new Japan, encapsulated in Fukoku Kyohei, enriched the country, strengthened the army, demanded a fundamental shift in military thinking. To stand against the West, Japan needed not a feudal warrior caste with divided loyalties, but a single, powerful, modern military force, loyal only to the emperor and the central government. This required a national army, built from the ground up on Western principles. The chief architect of this new military was Yamagata Aritomo, a samurai from Choshu who had witnessed Western military power firsthand. He understood that the old ways were insufficient. In 1873, he pushed through one of the Meiji era's most radical reforms, the Universal Conscription Law. This decree declared that all Japanese men, upon reaching the age of 20, were liable for 3 years of active military service, followed by 4 years in the reserves, regardless of their social background. This was a revolution in itself. For the first time in Japanese history, commoners, the sons of farmers, artisans, and merchants, would be trained in the arts of war. They would wear uniforms, carry rifles, and learn modern tactics. The law effectively democratized warfare, shattering the samurai's centuries-old monopoly. It created a blood tax, demanding that every citizen be prepared to serve the nation. While the law was universal in theory, it wasn't always in practice. Numerous exemptions existed: heads of households, government officials, students, and those who could afford to pay a hefty commutation fee were often excused. This meant the burden fell disproportionately on the second and third sons of poor rural families. Resistance was widespread. Riots and protests erupted as many commoners balked at this unfamiliar and frightening obligation. Despite the resistance, the principle held: Japan now had the means to create a large, standardized army. For the samurai, the implications were devastating. If any peasant could be turned into a soldier, what made the samurai special? Their hereditary right to fight, their years of dedicated training in traditional martial arts, all were rendered largely irrelevant by the rifle and the drill sergeant. Their primary function in society was being outsourced. This made their continued existence as a privileged class, drawing stipends and wearing swords, increasingly untenable in the eyes of the government. They were an expensive relic. Having tackled their political power by abolishing domains and their economic base by commuting stipends, the Meiji leaders now turned to the most potent symbol of their status, the sword. The path to the sword ban was gradual, part of a broader campaign to create a modern and civilized appearance, often meaning westernized. The government had already discouraged the traditional samurai top-knot hairstyle in 1871, seeing it as archaic. Regulations began appearing, limiting sword wearing in certain public places or on certain occasions. These were precursors, testing the waters before the final, decisive edict. Then, on March 28, 1876, the government issued the Daito Kinshirei, more commonly known as the Haitorei, the Sword Abolition Edict. Its language was simple and direct. From that point forward, only members of the National Armed Forces, police officers, and certain officials on ceremonial duty were permitted to wear swords. For everyone else, carrying these weapons in public was now illegal. The government presented this as a measure for public safety and a step towards modern enlightenment, aligning Japan with Western nations where civilians did not typically walk around armed with swords. It was also framed as a move towards equality, eliminating a key visual distinction between the former samurai and commoners. For the samurai, the Haitorei was the ultimate indignity. It wasn't just about giving up a weapon, it was about being stripped bare of their identity. The swords were the physical manifestation of their honor, their heritage, and their place in the world. To be forced to walk the streets without them felt like being publicly shamed, reduced to the level of a commoner. Many described feeling naked, vulnerable, and deeply dishonored. Imagine a samurai who had worn his daisho every single day of his adult life, as his father and grandfather had done before him. Now he had to leave them at home, gathering dust. Walking through town, he looked no different from the merchants or farmers he had once commanded or protected. His visible authority, his very essence, had been legislated out of existence. It was a profound psychological blow. The edict provoked outrage and despair. One samurai lamented, "We samurai, who have governed in these divine lands, must now with our own eyes look upon the withering of the way of the warrior. How can anyone with a Yamato spirit bear this?" For some, this humiliation was too much to endure. It became the final straw, pushing them towards open rebellion. Just months after the Haitorei was enacted, in October 1876, a group of about 200 hardline traditionalist samurai in Kumamoto, led by Otaguro Tomono, launched the Shinpuren Rebellion. Calling themselves the League of the Divine Wind, they were infuriated by the sword ban, the adoption of Western dress, and the perceived abandonment of traditional values. They launched a surprise night attack on the Imperial Army garrison in Kumamoto. Armed primarily with swords and spears against soldiers with rifles, their initial attack achieved shocking success due to its ferocity and surprise. They killed the garrison commander and many soldiers, but it was a doomed gesture. Once the Imperial forces regrouped, their superior firepower inevitably crushed the rebellion. The surviving leaders, including Otaguro, committed seppuku rather than surrender. It was a bloody, tragic testament to the passion the sword ban had ignited. The Shinpuren uprising, though quickly suppressed, highlighted the deep resentment simmering beneath the surface. It demonstrated how intertwined the sword was with the samurai's sense of self-worth and honor, and how its removal could drive them to desperate, suicidal acts. It was a clear signal that stripping away centuries of tradition would not happen without bloodshed. The conscription law and the Haitorei edict must be seen as two sides of the same coin, two deliberate blows aimed at dismantling the samurai class. The first act, conscription, took away their exclusive right to fight, making them militarily unnecessary. The second act, the sword ban, took away their badge of honor, making them socially indistinguishable. Together, these reforms effectively ended the samurai as a distinct entity. They were forced to lay down their swords, and with them, their claim to a special place in Japanese society. They were pushed, often unwillingly, into a new Japan, where status was increasingly determined not by birth or blade, but by education, wealth, and service to the modern state. For many, this transition was a crushing, soul-destroying ordeal. For the samurai, life was guided by an unwritten, yet deeply ingrained code of conduct. Bushido, the way of the warrior. This wasn't a single static document, but a set of moral principles evolving over centuries that defined what it meant to be a samurai. It was their ethical compass, their source of pride, and the very framework through which they understood their world and their place within it. It governed how they lived, how they served, and how they faced death. At its core lay righteousness or justice, but often expressed as unwavering loyalty. A samurai's primary duty was to his lord, the daimyo. This loyalty was expected to be absolute, often trumping personal feelings, family ties, and even life itself. It was the glue that held the feudal structure together. Service wasn't just a job, it was a sacred obligation, the primary path to fulfilling one's purpose. Then came courage. This wasn't just brute fearlessness, but a bravery tempered by intelligence and serenity. It meant facing danger on the battlefield without flinching, but also enduring hardship and adversity with stoic resolve. It was the courage to carry out one's duty, however difficult or perilous. Closely linked was jin, benevolence, a capacity for compassion, especially towards those weaker, a quality expected of a true leader. Other pillars included rei, respect, manifesting in elaborate etiquette, politeness, and a deep understanding of social hierarchy. Makoto or shin, honesty and sincerity, demanding truthfulness in word and deed, and, above all, meo, honor. A samurai's personal honor was paramount. Maintaining it and avoiding shame was a constant preoccupation, influencing every decision. A life without honor was considered worse than death. But what happens to such a code when the world it was built for implodes? The Meiji Restoration, with its rapid, sweeping changes, didn't just alter Japan's political landscape, it shattered the very foundations upon which Bushido rested. It triggered a profound, agonizing existential crisis within the heart of the samurai class. Their moral compass began to spin wildly, its North Star extinguished. Consider gi loyalty. With the Heihan Chiken Edict, the domains vanished. The daimyo, the lords to whom generations had pledged absolute fealty, were gone, retired, pensioned off, moved to Tokyo. Who was a samurai loyal to now? The abstract concept of the state or the emperor lacked the immediate personal connection of the lord-vassal relationship. Many felt adrift, like ships cut loose from their moorings, their primary duty dissolved. This loss of a clear object for loyalty was deeply disorienting. For centuries, their identity was defined by whom they served. Now, they were individuals, citizens, but this new identity often felt hollow. Some transferred their loyalty to the new government, finding roles as officials or officers. But for many, especially those whose domains had opposed the restoration, this felt like a betrayal. They were left in a vacuum of allegiance. And courage? Its traditional arena, the battlefield, was being transformed. The new conscript army valued disciplined rifle fire over individual sword charges. Where was the place for a samurai's personal valor when faced with an artillery barrage? Some sought to prove their courage in doomed rebellions, fighting a desperate rearguard action against modernity itself. Their bravery was undeniable, but often tragic and futile. For others, courage took on a new, far less glorious form. It became the courage to endure poverty, the courage to swallow pride and take up menial work, the courage to face the scorn or pity of their neighbors. It was the quiet, internal struggle to adapt to a world that no longer valued their traditional strengths. This was perhaps a harder, less celebrated form of bravery. Meiyo honor suffered perhaps the most grievous blows. How could a samurai maintain his honor when he couldn't afford to feed his family? When his hereditary stipend was replaced by rapidly depreciating government bonds? When he was forced to sell his ancestors' swords or take up a merchant's trade, an occupation his class had long despised? Every aspect of the new reality seemed designed to inflict shame. The sword ban, the Haitorei, was a public assault on their honor. The sword was the visible proof of their status. To be denied it was to be publicly stripped of their distinction. The need to bow to Westerners, whose presence many still saw as a national humiliation, added to the sting. The very code that demanded they uphold their honor made it incredibly painful to live in a world where doing so seemed impossible. This led to the most fundamental question: what was their purpose? They were trained for war in an era of enforced peace. They were a ruling class in a system moving towards equality. They were guardians whose protection was no longer required. Their skills, honed through years of rigorous, often spiritual training, swordsmanship, archery, strategy, were becoming museum pieces. They were living relics. This sense of uselessness was a heavy psychological burden. Imagine dedicating your entire life to mastering a craft, only to wake up one day and find that craft utterly obsolete. It's a recipe for depression, apathy, and despair. Many samurai struggled to find meaning in this new Japan. They were warriors without a war, leaders without privileges. Some, particularly the educated and adaptable, tried to reinvent Bushido, applying its principles to new fields. Shibusawa Eiichi, often called the father of Japanese capitalism, though not a high-ranking samurai himself, infused his business practices with Confucian ethics, arguing that commerce could be pursued with honor and for the national good. He saw a way, even in the New World. Many ex-samurai entered government service, teaching, police work, or the military officer corps, finding new avenues to express their traditional values of duty, discipline, and service. They formed the backbone of the Meiji state's administration and military leadership. They channeled their loyalty towards building the new Japan, even if it meant sacrificing their own class. But many others failed to make this transition. They lacked the skills, the capital, or the mindset to succeed in business or farming. Their pride held them back from manual labor. Some clung fiercely to the past, joining secret societies or participating in rebellions, unable to accept the new reality. Others simply drifted, falling into poverty, alcoholism, or even petty crime. Their stories are the forgotten tragedies of the era. The weight of their heritage was immense. They carried the names and the legacies of ancestors who had fought at Sekigahara or served legendary lords. This lineage, once a source of immense pride, could now feel like an impossible burden. How could they face their ancestors when they couldn't even maintain their family's standing or wield their swords? The internal conflict was intense. For some, the shame and loss of purpose were too much to bear. The ultimate expression of samurai despair, seppuku, or ritual suicide, though not widespread, did occur. Leaders of failed rebellions like Saigo Takamori or Otaguro Tomo chose death over surrender, adhering to the old code to the very end. Others may have taken their lives more quietly, seeing no honorable path forward in a world they no longer understood. This period was, for many samurai, an internal battlefield. The clash was not primarily against foreign powers or even rival domains anymore. It was within their own minds. It was a struggle between the deeply ingrained values of Bushido and the harsh demands of a rapidly changing world. It was a fight to reconcile their identity as warriors with the reality of a nation seeking peace and industrial might. They were caught between eras, products of a feudal age thrust unceremoniously into modernity. Their code, which had provided meaning and structure for centuries, now often seemed like a liability, a source of conflict and pain. While some found new ways to live with honor, many found their world stripped of its meaning, leaving them with an existential crisis few could truly comprehend. It was a quiet, internal suffering that defined why it truly sucked to be a samurai during these tumultuous times. The sweeping changes of the Meiji Restoration, the loss of domains, stipends, swords, and status, did not land softly. For many samurai, these reforms were not just unwelcome, they were unbearable insults, a betrayal of their heritage and their sacrifices. While some adapted and others sank into quiet despair, a significant number felt that honor demanded resistance. The deep well of resentment, poverty, and wounded pride inevitably began to overflow into open. These weren't coordinated efforts to overthrow the government nationwide. Rather, they were often localized, desperate, flashes of anger, cries of defiance against an encroaching modernity that seemed determined to erase their very existence. They were the death throes of a dying class, tragic attempts to turn back the tide of history with swords against steel. The first significant eruption occurred in 1874, the Saga Rebellion. It was led, ironically, by Eto Shinpei, a man who had been a key figure in the early Meiji government, serving as a counselor of state. Eto had resigned, alongside Saigo Takamori, after losing the Seikanron debate, a proposal to invade Korea which he saw as a way to provide purpose for restless samurai and assert Japan's international standing. Returning to his native Saga, Eto found a population of deeply discontented samurai. They resented the central government's reforms and felt their contributions to the restoration had been ignored. Eto, using his prestige, formed the Patriotic Party of Saga and soon raised an army. He hoped other domains, particularly Satsuma, would join him. But help did not arrive. The Meiji government, led by Okubo Toshimichi, Eto's former colleague, reacted swiftly and decisively. They deployed the newly formed Imperial Army, utilizing steamships to transport troops quickly. The rebellion was crushed within weeks. Eto Shinpei fled but was captured and, in a move designed to deter future rebels, executed and his head put on public display. It was a stark warning. Despite the brutal suppression of the Saga Rebellion, the fires of discontent continued to smolder. In 1876, the year the Haitorei sword ban was enacted, the flames burst forth again. In Kumamoto, on the island of Kyushu, a group of about 200 fiercely traditionalist samurai formed the Shinpuren, or League of the Divine Wind. They were driven by a xenophobic anti-modern ideology, viewing the Meiji reforms as a betrayal of Japan's divine spirit. Led by Otagoro Tomomu, they believed Shinto gods would aid them. On a stormy night in October, armed almost exclusively with swords and spears, they launched a surprise attack on the Imperial Army garrison at Kumamoto Castle. Their fanatical charge caught the modern soldiers off guard, and they managed to kill the garrison commander and dozens of troops. It was a brief, shocking moment of apparent success, but spiritual fervor was no match for organized firepower. The remaining Imperial soldiers regrouped, and their rifles cut down the Shinpuren warriors. The rebellion collapsed in less than a day. Otagoro and his key followers committed ritual suicide rather than be captured. It was a bloody, futile gesture, highlighting the desperation of those who utterly rejected the new era. The Shinpuren's desperate act inspired others. Just days later, the Akizuki rebellion flared up in a nearby domain. Former samurai led by Isojun rose up, spurred on by the news from Kumamoto. Their plan was to link up with rebels in Hagi, the former capital of Choshu, another domain seething with discontent. The Hagi rebellion was led by Maibara Ise, another former Meiji counselor. Both these uprisings suffered the same fate. They were poorly coordinated, lacked widespread support, and were swiftly crushed by the imperial army. Maibara Ise was captured and executed. These small, scattered rebellions served only to demonstrate the futility of armed resistance and to further convince the government of the need for a strong, centralized military. But the greatest test was yet to come. All eyes eventually turned to the deep south, to Satsuma, and to its most famous son, Saigo Takamori. Saigo was a colossal figure, both physically and historically. He was a principal leader of the Meiji Restoration, a military genius, and a man widely admired even by his enemies for his integrity and embodiment of samurai virtues. He was often called the last true samurai. Like Eto Shinpei, Saigo had left the government in 1873 after the Seikhanran debate. He believed Japan had a duty to punish Korea for perceived insults, but also saw it as a vital outlet for the energies and martial skills of the dispossessed samurai. When his proposal was rejected in favor of domestic modernization, Saigo, feeling betrayed, resigned from all his posts and returned to his home in Kagoshima. He did not, however, retire into quiet obscurity. In Kagoshima, Saigo established a network of shigako, private academies. These schools provided education and, crucially, military training to the thousands of loyal samurai who flocked to him. They studied strategy, practiced swordsmanship and gunnery, and absorbed Saigo's traditionalist philosophy. These shigako essentially became a private army. Satsuma, historically proud and semi-autonomous, began to function almost as an independent state. Samurai here still wore their swords, lived by the old code, and looked to Saigo as their true leader. It was a bastion of samurai tradition, a powder keg waiting for a spark in the heart of modernizing Japan. The Meiji government in Tokyo watched developments in Satsuma with growing alarm. They saw Saigo's influence and his private army as a direct threat. In late 1876 and early 1877, they took steps that would ignite the keg. They sent ships to remove weapons and ammunition from the Kagoshima arsenal and dispatched police officers, some of whom were later accused of plotting Saigo's assassination. These actions infuriated the Shigako students. They saw it as a direct provocation, proof of Tokyo's hostile intentions. They raided the arsenal themselves and, in a frenzy of anger and devotion, pleaded with Saigo to lead them against the corrupt central government. Saigo, caught between his loyalty to his followers and his past loyalty to the emperor, felt he had no choice. Reluctantly, perhaps, he agreed to march. In February 1877, Saigo Takamori led an army of around 15,000 samurai north. Their stated aim was not to overthrow the emperor, but to travel to Tokyo to question the central government about its policies and the alleged assassination plot. It was a massive challenge, the largest internal threat the Meiji state had yet faced. Their path was blocked at Kumamoto Castle, the same fortress attacked by the Shinpuren just months earlier. Saigo expected the garrison, led by Tani Tateki, a Taosa native, to join him or be quickly overrun. He was wrong. The imperial garrison, though heavily outnumbered, held firm within the castle's modernized defenses. They were also composed largely of conscripts. The siege of Kumamoto Castle became the critical turning point. Saigo's samurai, fighting with traditional tactics and immense bravery, could not break through. The conscript soldiers, fighting for their new nation and armed with modern rifles, proved their mettle. They held out for nearly 2 months, bogging Saigo down, shattering his momentum, and buying precious time for the central government. The Meiji government responded with its full might. Yamagata Aritomo took command, mobilizing the entire Imperial Japanese Army. They used railways and steamships to rapidly deploy tens of thousands of troops and vast quantities of supplies to Kyushu. It was a demonstration of the very modernization Saigo's followers resisted, and it was devastatingly effective. The imperial forces relieved Kumamoto Castle, and then began the long, bloody process of pushing Saigo's army back south. The Battle of Tabaruzaka, a brutal, week-long engagement fought in March, became a meat grinder. The imperial army's overwhelming advantage in firepower and numbers eventually wore down the Satsuma samurai. Despite fighting with incredible ferocity, Saigo's forces were forced into a slow, fighting retreat. The rebellion lasted for nearly 8 months, but the outcome was never truly in doubt. After Kumamoto, Saigo's army, dwindling through casualties and desertions, was hounded across Kyushu. They were fighting yesterday's war against tomorrow's army. Their swordsmanship, their individual skill, counted for little against artillery shells and disciplined volleys of rifle fire. Finally, in September 1877, Saigo and his last few hundred followers were surrounded on Shiroyama, a hill overlooking Kagoshima. Outnumbered almost 60-1, with little ammunition left, their situation was hopeless. Yet they refused to surrender. In the pre-dawn hours of September 24th, they made one final desperate charge. Armed largely with swords, they plunged into the imperial lines. It was a suicidal act of defiance, a final, tragic expression of the samurai spirit. They were mown down by rifle and Gatling gun fire. Saigo himself was gravely wounded. According to legend, he was carried aside by his loyal retainer, Beppu Shinsuke, who helped him commit seppuku, beheading him afterwards to prevent his head from being taken as a trophy. The Battle of Shiroyama marked the end of the Satsuma Rebellion and the final, definitive end of the samurai as a military force in Japan. It was a bloody, tragic affair, costing thousands of lives and vast sums of money. It proved, beyond any doubt, the success of the Meiji government's military reforms and the strength of the new conscript army. The defeat sealed the fate of the old warrior class. There would be no more armed uprisings. The samurai had to accept their place in the new Japan or fade away. Yet, paradoxically, Saigo Takamori, the leader of the rebellion, was posthumously pardoned and eventually became a national hero. He is remembered not as a traitor, but as a tragic figure who embodied the virtues of sincerity, courage, and loyalty, even in a doomed cause. His last stand was the final, heartbreaking chapter in why it sucked to be a samurai when their world came crashing down. With the smoke clearing over Shiroyama and the echoes of the last samurai charge fading into history, a stark, unavoidable reality set in for the nearly 2 million individuals known as Shizoku, the former samurai. The path of armed resistance was closed, a bloody dead end. There was no going back to the age of domains and daimyos. The Meiji government, forged in conflict and driven by a relentless vision of modernity, stood supreme. The only choice left was to find a place within this new, often bewildering Japan. This wasn't merely a suggestion, it was an imperative. The government, while a driving force in dismantling the old order, knew it couldn't simply abandon this significant portion of the population. They actively pushed the policy of Shizoku no Shushan, encouraging and sometimes coercing former samurai to find productive employment. They offered loans, land grants, particularly in the frontier lands of Hokkaido, and retraining schemes, hoping to channel samurai energies into nation building. Yet these programs often fell short. Bureaucratic hurdles, insufficient funding, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the samurai mindset limited their success. The government wanted them to become farmers, merchants, and artisans, but it couldn't easily legislate away centuries of ingrained culture, pride, and a lack of practical experience in these fields. The transition, for most, would be a painful personal struggle. For some, the most natural path lay in service to the new state, albeit in a transformed capacity. The rapidly expanding Imperial Japanese Army and the newly established police force needed disciplined men. Many former samurai, particularly those from the victorious domains or those willing to embrace the new military ways, found careers as officers. It offered a uniform, a clear hierarchy, and a sense of serving the nation. But it wasn't the same. They served alongside commoners, men they once considered their inferiors. They answered not to a personal lord, but to an abstract state. Their beloved swords were replaced by Western-style sabers and rifles. While it provided a measure of continuity and status for some, it was still a far cry from the life of a traditional bushi. Police work, while offering authority, often involved dealing with petty crime, a stark contrast to dreams of battlefield glory. Another significant avenue was the burgeoning Meiji bureaucracy. The central government needed literate, educated individuals to manage its ministries, implement its reforms, and staff its local administrations. Samurai, being the most educated class of the Edo period, were well suited for these roles. They filled the ranks of clerks, officials, and administrators, becoming the cogs in the new machinery of state. Similarly, the creation of a national education system opened up opportunities for samurai to become teachers. They imparted knowledge, often a mix of traditional Confucian ethics and new Western learning, to the next generation. These roles offered respectability and utilized their scholarly backgrounds, but they represented a definitive shift from warrior to civil servant or intellectual. The ink brush replaced the sword. Perhaps the most difficult and often most humiliating path was into the world of commerce and industry. Bushido had traditionally viewed merchants and the pursuit of profit with disdain. Honor, not money, was the samurai's currency. Yet, in Meiji Japan, commerce was being elevated as a key to national strength. Samurai were encouraged, even pressured, to become businessmen, to start companies, to engage in trade. This was a profound culture shock. Many samurai who attempted business ventures, the Shizoku no Shoho, failed spectacularly. They lacked capital, understanding of markets, and basic business sense. Their sense of pride often made them poor negotiators or unwilling to engage in grubby commercial practices. They were frequently cheated or simply outmaneuvered by experienced merchants. The sight of a proud samurai forced to haggle over prices was a potent symbol of their fallen status. There were, of course, notable exceptions. Iwasaki Yataro, a low-ranking samurai from Tosa, built the Mitsubishi Empire. Shibusawa Iechi championed a form of ethical capitalism rooted in Confucian ideals. But these men were visionary and exceptionally adaptable. For every Shibusawa, there were hundreds whose ventures collapsed, leaving them deeper in debt and despair. Some sought refuge in the land, attempting to become farmers. The government encouraged this, offering land grants, especially in Hokkaido, as part of its efforts to colonize the northern island and create a buffer against Russia. Samurai families packed their meager belongings and headed north, hoping to build a new life from the soil. But here too, hardship awaited. Most samurai knew nothing of farming. They were unaccustomed to the back-breaking physical labor, the uncertainties of weather, and the complexities of cultivation. The harsh climate of Hokkaido made farming particularly challenging. Many of these todanehe, or farmer soldiers, faced crop failures, debt, and a lonely existence far from their ancestral homes. It was a world away from the castles and towns they had known. A smaller number turned to their skills in traditional arts. Calligraphy, painting, poetry, and even martial arts instruction offered avenues for employment. Some found patronage or managed to eke out a living as teachers or artisans. But these fields were often overcrowded and offered little financial security. It was a way to preserve a part of their heritage, but rarely a path to prosperity. Tragically, a significant number of former samurai simply could not adapt. They slipped through the cracks of the new society. Stripped of their stipends, unable or unwilling to find new work, they fell into desperate poverty. Proud warriors became rickshaw pullers, day laborers, street vendors, or beggars. Some, consumed by bitterness or despair, turned to crime or drowned their sorrows in alcohol. These were the hidden casualties of modernization. Even for those who found successful new careers, the internal struggle was immense. It was the daily friction of an old soul rubbing against a new world. A samurai-turned-policeman had to enforce laws made by bureaucrats, sometimes against his former comrades. A samurai-turned-merchant had to prioritize profit, often clashing with ingrained ideas of honor and obligation. A samurai-turned-teacher had to explain a world that often contradicted the values he held dear. The core conflict was often symbolized as the sword versus the ledger, or the sword versus the abacus. The sword represented their past, honor, loyalty, martial skill, a life defined by status and service. The ledger represented their present and future, commerce, bureaucracy, money, a life defined by contracts, numbers, and individual economic survival. Learning to wield the ledger often felt like a betrayal of the sword. This internal conflict bred a quiet melancholy, a sense of loss that lingered even among the successful. They might wear Western suits and work in modern offices, but their minds often wrestled with the ghosts of their past. They felt the weight of their ancestors' expectations, a silent judgment on their new, often unsamurai-like lives. It was a constant, low-level, existential hum beneath the surface of Meiji progress. Yet, it is crucial to recognize that many did survive and adapt. The discipline, literacy, and strong sense of duty instilled by their samurai upbringing proved to be valuable assets in building modern Japan. Former samurai and their descendants played pivotal roles in government, industry, the military, and education throughout the Meiji era and beyond. They shaped the new nation in profound ways. But this success should not overshadow the immense personal cost. The transition was rarely smooth or painless. It demanded compromises, swallowed pride, and shattered identities. The Shizoku paid a heavy price for Japan's leap into modernity. Their story is a powerful reminder that progress often leaves deep scars, and that adapting to a world that no longer needs you is one of the most painful struggles any human can endure. For centuries, every person in Japan knew their place. The Tokugawa Shogunate presided over a society rigidly structured by the Shi-no-kosho system, a four-tiered hierarchy borrowed from Confucian ideals. At the absolute pinnacle stood the Shi, the samurai. They were the warriors, the administrators, the scholars, the ruling elite, comprising roughly 7% of the population. Their role was to govern and protect. And below the samurai came the farmers. In a society where rice was the measure of wealth and the source of life, farmers were considered the productive backbone. Though often living harsh lives and heavily taxed, their position was, theoretically, second only to the samurai. They sustained the nation. Their diligence was seen as virtuous. Next were the artisans and craftsmen. These individuals possessed the skills to create the tools, goods, and art that define Japanese culture. Swordsmiths, potters, weavers, woodworkers. Their craftsmanship was valued, but they were seen as secondary producers, working with materials often provided by others. They added value but did not create primary wealth. At the very bottom, officially at least, were the merchants. According to Confucian thought, merchants were considered the least productive, almost parasitic class. They didn't grow anything or make anything, they simply traded goods made by others, often profiting from fluctuations in price. They dealt with filthy lucre, money, which was seen as less noble than the honest productivity of rice. This was the ideal, the official blueprint of society. The samurai, by birthright and function, were the undisputed masters, entitled to respect, stipends, and the right to wear swords. The merchants, despite their potential wealth, were socially constrained, often forced to live frugally, at least publicly, and denied the symbols of status enjoyed by the samurai. But even during the long peace of the Edo period, this rigid structure was being eroded from within. As Japan developed a sophisticated cash economy, it was the merchants who thrived. They controlled trade routes, managed finances, and lent money. Many powerful daimyo and impoverished samurai fell deeply into debt to the very merchant houses they officially scorned. Economic power was shifting, even if social status remained fixed. The Meiji Restoration didn't just cause ripples in this structure. It triggered a tidal wave, a social earthquake that shattered the old hierarchy and threw the pieces into the air. The Shinokosho system was formally abolished. The new government championed ideals of equality, though often selectively applied, and above all valued a new kind of productivity, the kind needed to build a modern, industrial nation. Suddenly, the merchants, long relegated to the bottom rung, found their star ascending. The Meiji government's focus on Fukoku Kyohei enriched the country, meant that commerce, finance, and industry were no longer despised activities, but vital national interests. Merchants possessed the capital, the networks, and the practical skills needed to build factories, railways, and shipping lines. The government actively courted and collaborated with established merchant houses like Mitsui and Sumitomo, whose roots stretched deep into the Edo period. These families, with their vast wealth and business acumen, became crucial partners in Japan's modernization drive. They were granted contracts, monopolies, and government support, transforming them from socially constrained traders into powerful captains of industry. This era saw the birth of the zaibatsu, colossal family-controlled industrial and financial conglomerates. Alongside old houses like Mitsui and Sumitomo, new giants emerged, often founded by individuals with incredible drive and political connections. Iwasaki Yataro, a former low-ranking samurai, leveraged government connections to build the Mitsubishi Empire, starting with shipping and expanding into mining, banking, and heavy industry. These zaibatsu became the new economic aristocracy. They built vast fortunes, wielded immense influence over government policy, and lived lifestyles of unprecedented luxury. Their rise was a stunning reversal of the old order. a testament to the new power of capital in Meiji Japan. Money, once scorned, now spoke with undeniable authority. For the struggling former samurai, watching this ascent was often a source of profound bitterness. These were the men they had been taught to look down upon, the chonin, obsessed with profit. Now, these merchants wore Western suits, lived in grand houses, advised government ministers, and sometimes even purchased titles or married into impoverished samurai families, acquiring the status that money could now buy. It felt like a world turned upside down, a deep injustice. How could these parasites now hold such power, while they, the former protectors and rulers, were reduced to selling their heirlooms or pulling rickshaws? This resentment fueled much of the anti-modern sentiment that simmered beneath the surface, a feeling that Japan was losing its soul in its pursuit of wealth. But it wasn't just merchants who rose. The Meiji Restoration created another powerful new elite, the kanryo, or government bureaucrats. A centralized state needed a vast administrative network to function, to collect taxes, enforce laws, build infrastructure, and manage foreign relations. This required a legion of educated, disciplined officials. While many of the top oligarchs came from samurai backgrounds, primarily Satsuma and Choshu, the ranks below them were increasingly filled through a new system based on education and competitive examinations, modeled partly on Western civil services. This opened doors for talented individuals, regardless of their exact lineage, though former samurai often had an advantage due to their higher literacy rates. These bureaucrats wielded a new kind of power, the power of the pen, the regulation, the policy document. They drafted the laws that reshaped Japan, controlled the flow of government funds, and implemented the grand vision of the Meiji leaders. They were the architects and managers of the modern state, their influence felt in every corner of the nation. Their status derived not from swords, but from their position within the state apparatus. For the samurai, their view of these bureaucrats was often ambivalent. On one hand, government service was seen as an honorable path, a way to continue serving the nation. Many samurai eagerly sought these positions, finding a new sense of purpose, however diminished. It was a respectable, if often poorly paid, career. On the other hand, many samurai resented the petty officials and their endless regulations. They saw them as meddlesome paper pushers, lacking the martial spirit and moral authority of the old warrior class. They chafed under rules made by men they didn't always respect, and often found themselves at the mercy of bureaucratic decisions that could determine their financial fate or access to opportunities. The Meiji era thus created a new, more fluid social ladder. At the very top stood a small group, the Meiji oligarchs, top military leaders, imperial family members, and the heads of the great zaibatsu. Below them came high-ranking bureaucrats, successful industrialists, professionals like doctors and lawyers, and large landowners. Further down were smaller merchants, factory managers, teachers, local officials, and skilled artisans. And at the bottom were the tenant farmers, factory workers, day laborers, and tragically many former samurai who had failed to find a secure footing in this new world. Their old status meant almost nothing, their economic reality was everything. This dramatic reshuffling was perhaps one of the most sucky aspects for the average samurai. They had grown up believing they were the natural leaders, the moral and social superiors. Now they were often forced to defer to men whose their grandfathers would have dismissed with a wave of a hand. They saw wealth and influence concentrated in hands they considered unworthy. The world no longer valued their birthright or their martial code as highly as it valued a fat bank account or a position in the Ministry of Finance. It was a profound daily reminder of their fall from grace, a constant source of friction and humiliation in a society that had once been theirs to command. The rise of the new elite starkly illuminated the depths of the samurai's decline. Within the samurai code of Bushido, no act was more deeply intertwined with honor, shame, and finality than seppuku. Known more crudely in the West as harakiri, which simply means belly cutting, seppuku was far more than mere suicide. It was a solemn, highly ritualized act, reserved almost exclusively for the samurai class, a final, often terrible assertion of will and control in the face of insurmountable circumstances. It was a way to die by one's own hand, preserving or restoring honor when life no longer offered that possibility. The ritual itself was stark and demanding. Typically, the samurai would dress in a white kimono, the color of death and purity. He would kneel upon a tatami mat, often with his daisho placed before him. Using a tanto, a short knife, he would make a precise, deep cut across his abdomen, first horizontally, and sometimes followed by a vertical cut. This method was chosen for its excruciating pain, demonstrating the warrior's ultimate courage and self-control. To spare the individual prolonged agony and maintain decorum, a kaishakunin or second, usually a trusted friend or skilled swordsman, stood ready. At an agreed-upon moment, often as the samurai made the cut or reached for his tanto, the kaishakunin would perform dakiku-bi, a swift, nearly complete decapitation with a katana, leaving just enough skin attached at the front so the head would fall forward into the samurai's arms, avoiding an unseemly tumble. Before the act, many samurai would compose a jisei, a death poem. These poignant verses, often reflecting on life's impermanence, nature, or the circumstances leading to their death, offered a final expression of their state of mind. The entire ritual, from the preparation to the final cut, was designed to showcase the samurai's composure, courage, and adherence to code, even at the moment of death. Throughout the Edo period, seppuku was performed for various, clearly understood reasons. It could be a form of capital punishment, allowing a samurai convicted of a serious crime to die honorably rather than by the hand of an executioner. It could be an act of junshi, following one's lord in death, though this practice was officially discouraged by the shogunate for much of the period as it depleted valuable retainers. It could also serve as kanshi, a form of protest against a lord's unjust actions, where a samurai would sacrifice his life in the hope of making his master see reason. More commonly, it was a way to atone for a personal failure, a breach of duty, or a grave error in judgment. And in times of war, it was the preferred method to avoid capture by the enemy, denying them the satisfaction of taking a samurai alive and ensuring one died with honor intact. The Meiji Restoration, however, introduced a new, complex set of pressures that twisted the traditional meanings of seppuku. While old reasons, like avoiding capture after failed rebellions, persisted, new, more insidious catalysts emerged. The rapid dismantling of their world created a perfect storm of poverty, shame, and existential despair, pushing some samurai towards this ultimate tragic act. The crushing poverty that befell many samurai after the abolition of their stipends was a primary driver. Imagine a man raised to believe his purpose was to rule and fight, now unable to put food on the table. The humiliation of selling heirlooms, taking dishonorable jobs, or watching his family suffer was for some an unbearable stain on their meiyo, their honor. In such a context, seppuku could be seen as an escape from a life perceived as intolerably degrading. The loss of status and purpose also played a critical role. Stripped of their swords, their right to rule, and their military function, many felt useless, adrift in a society that no longer valued them. Their Bushido code, which emphasized duty and martial prowess, now seemed hollow. For those unable to adapt, unable to find a new way, the void could become all-consuming. Seppuku offered a final, desperate way to assert their samurai identity in a world that denied it. Seppuku also re-emerged as a potent, if doomed, form of political protest. The leaders of the Shinpuren rebellion in Kumamoto, facing defeat after their fanatical attack, chose ritual suicide over surrender. Their deaths were meant as a final, bloody condemnation of the Meiji government's modernization policies, a testament to their unwavering, if anachronistic, commitment to the old ways. These acts, though carried out by a few, resonated deeply within the former samurai class. They highlighted the chasm between the government's vision of progress and the profound sense of loss felt by many warriors. They were public statements of defiance, asserting that some values were worth dying for, even when the cause was lost. The most famous, and perhaps most symbolic death of this era was that of Saigo Takamori at the Battle of Shiroyama. Surrounded and wounded, facing certain defeat, he performed seppuku or was assisted in doing so rather than fall into enemy hands. Saigo, the last true samurai, ended his life in a manner befitting his image. His death cemented his status as a tragic hero, embodying both the virtues and the ultimate failure of the old warrior code. Saigo's end became a powerful narrative, reinforcing the idea that an honorable death was preferable to a compromised life in the New Japan. It provided a dramatic, if tragic, example for those feeling trapped by the changing times. It romanticized, in a way, the idea of choosing death as a final act of samurai agency. Did these pressures lead to a statistically significant increase in seppuku? It's difficult to say with certainty, as records are incomplete. It's unlikely that vast numbers chose this path. The majority endured, adapted, or faded away. However, what certainly did increase was the visibility and symbolic weight of seppuku as a response to the specific pressures of the Meiji era. It became inextricably linked with the samurai's plight. The key shift was in the reason. While traditional seppuku was often about upholding a specific duty or code within the existing system, Meiji-era seppuku frequently became a response to the collapse of that system. It wasn't just about atoning for failure. It was about the perceived failure of the world itself, its betrayal of the values the samurai held sacred. It was the ultimate expression of an existential crisis. When your entire worldview, your moral compass, your sense of self is rendered obsolete, the psychological toll can be immense. When Bushido offered no guidance for becoming a clerk or a farmer, and when honor seemed impossible to maintain amid poverty and humiliation, the ritualized self-destruction of seppuku appeared to some as the only path left. It was a way to impose order on a chaotic world, to make one final, meaningful choice according to the old rules, when the new rules seemed incomprehensible or unacceptable. It was an attempt to snatch a form of honor from the jaws of perceived shame, even at the cost of life itself. We must view these acts not with morbid fascination but with a deep sense of tragedy. These were men pushed to the brink, trapped between an irrecoverable past and an unlivable present. Their choice, while alien to many today, stemmed from a profound sense of loss and an inability to reconcile their identity with their reality. Seppuku in this context was the ultimate escape, not just from poverty or hardship, but from a world that had fundamentally ceased to make sense. It was the final devastating testament to why it sucked, often to the point of death, to be a samurai during the fall of feudal Japan. We've journeyed through the twilight years of feudal Japan, walking alongside a figure steeped in legend yet burdened by a harsh reality, the samurai. We saw them in their gilded cage during the long peace of the Edo period, masters in a world that was already imperceptibly beginning to shift beneath their feet. We felt the shock as Commodore Perry's black ships shattered their isolation, forcing a confrontation with a world they could neither ignore nor easily comprehend. We witnessed the shogunate crumble, torn apart by internal dissent and external pressure. We heard the cry of sononjoi, a desperate plea for a return to tradition, even as modernity hammered at the gates. We saw samurai turn against samurai in the Boshin War, a conflict that ultimately paved the way not for a return to glory, but for a revolution that would consume its own. The Meiji Restoration. Then came the dismantling. We tracked the deliberate, systematic erasure of a way of life. The abolition of domains, severing their ties to their lords and lands, the creation of a conscript army rendering their martial skills obsolete, the dreaded Haitorei, stripping them of their swords, the very soul of their identity. And finally, the Chitsuroku Shobun, the abolition of their stipends, casting thousands into sudden, shocking poverty. It wasn't a single blow, but a relentless cascade of losses. Their political power vanished, their economic security evaporated, their social status plummeted, their military purpose was given to commoners, their most cherished symbols were outlawed. Their code, Bushido, designed for a world of feudal loyalty and battlefield honor, seemed a poor guide for navigating a world of commerce, bureaucracy, and international diplomacy. This is why it truly sucked to be a samurai during this fall. It was an identity crisis on a national scale, played out in the lives of millions. They were the very symbols of old Japan, and as Japan raced to reinvent itself, it cast off its old symbols. They became anachronisms, living ghosts in a land that was rushing to forget the very world that had created them. Their past became a liability. It's crucial to acknowledge the paradox here. The Meiji Restoration, despite its harshness, was undeniably a success for Japan as a nation. It spurred rapid modernization, fostered industrial growth, and, critically, allowed Japan to avoid the fate of colonization that befell many other nations in Asia. The Meiji leaders, many former samurai themselves, made brutal choices, but arguably, they saved Japan's sovereignty. But this national success was built upon the wreckage of the samurai class. Progress, as history so often teaches us, is rarely a gentle process. It demands change, and change demands sacrifice. The samurai were the primary sacrifice laid upon the altar of modern Japan. Their struggle serves as a poignant, enduring reminder that even necessary change carries a profound human cost. Did the samurai and their spirit simply vanish? Not entirely. While the class was abolished, the ethos of Bushido proved remarkably resilient. It was reinterpreted, reshaped, and often co-opted. Its ideals of loyalty, discipline, self-sacrifice, and national pride were channeled into the new imperial army, into the rapidly growing industries, and into the fervent nationalism that would define Japan in the early 20th century. These echoes of Bushido had both positive and negative consequences, shaping Japan's triumphs and its tragedies in the decades to come. The discipline helped fuel economic miracles, but the unquestioning loyalty and martial fervor also contributed to disastrous military adventures. The shadow of the fallen blade proved to be long indeed. So as we draw this journey to a close, let's look beyond the cherry blossoms and gleaming swords, beyond the romanticized image. Let's see the human beings caught in the gears of history, see the warrior struggling to understand a world without war, the aristocrat facing poverty, the loyal retainer without a lord, the honorable man forced into a life he felt was shameful. See their confusion, their anger, their despair, and their often quiet resilience. The fall of the samurai was not just a political shift, it was the shattering of an entire way of life, a code and an identity that had defined Japan for centuries. Their struggle to find purpose in a world that no longer valued their martial spirit is a poignant reminder of how progress, however necessary, can be devastating for those whose lives are rooted in the past. It's a story of obsolescence and the pain it inflicts. So, as you drift towards slumber, perhaps let the quiet echo of a samurai's final, desperate stand remind you of this profound human cost of change. Think of the painful sacrifice made by those who became obsolete, paving the way for the dawn of a new age they could never truly belong to. Their silence speaks volumes about the relentless march of time. Thanks for listening tonight as we've navigated these turbulent currents of forgotten history together. We hope this journey through the twilight of the samurai has offered some perspective, some quiet food for thought. May your dreams be filled with understanding, and may you awaken with a renewed appreciation for the complex, often painful, tapestry of the past. Sleep well.